December 20th, 1943. Over the frozen skies of Bremen, Germany. A 21-year-old American boy is bleeding at 27,000 feet. His name is Charlie Brown, and right now his hands are shaking on the controls of a dying aircraft that should already be a fireball. 21 German fighters hit them. 21. His tail gunner is dead. His co-pilot is slumped, barely breathing. One engine is gone. A second is on fire. The nose cone has been ripped, completely open, and a December gale is howling through the aircraft like something alive. By every law of war, by every calculation of survival, Charlie Brown is already dead. And then, something happens. Something that two governments spent 47 years trying to erase. A German fighter pilot pulls up alongside him. Not to finish the kill. To do something else. Something that would cost both men everything. Something that reveals a truth about war, about honor, about what it means to be human. That the machinery of two powerful nations tried their hardest to bury. This is the story of Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler. And if you think you know where this is going, you don't. Before we go any further, if you found this story in the first 30 seconds, the algorithm brought you here for a reason. Subscribe right now, because next week there is a story coming from the Korean War, a decision made in a battlefield hospital that the U.S. Army buried for 30 years. You will not find it anywhere else. Subscribe. Don't miss it. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Franz Stigler was born on August 8th, 1915, in Regensburg, Bavaria, a city of Gothic cathedrals, river mist, and church bells marking the hours over ancient stone streets. His father was a schoolteacher. His older brother, August, became a pilot. And from the time Franz was old enough to tilt his head back and watch biplanes banking over the Bavarian hills, he wanted nothing more than to follow his brother into that blue. He learned to fly in the late 1930s. He was gifted, extraordinarily so. His instructors called him exceptional. His hands were steady. His judgment in the air was almost supernatural. But here is the detail that every other history video gets wrong about Franz Stigler. He was not a fanatic. He wasn't burning with Nazi ideology. He wasn't a true believer. He was, by every account of everyone who knew him, a deeply religious Catholic, a quiet man, with a moral center that the war had not yet managed to destroy. His brother August died in 1941, shot down over Egypt. Franz Stigler didn't harden. He grieved, and then he kept flying. By December 1943, Franz Stigler was a decorated ace with 27 confirmed aerial kills, 1 kill away from the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest military honor. He flew with Jagdgeschwader 27, based near Bremen. He was 28 years old. He was exhausted, and he carried inside him something a mentor named Gustav Rödel had once told him, years earlier, that he had never forgotten. Rödel had pointed to the old codes of aerial combat and said, roughly, "If I ever see you shoot a man who cannot fight back, I will shoot you down, myself. We are fighters, not murderers." Franz Stigler carried those words like a compass. Now, picture the other side of the Atlantic. Charles Brown grew up in Weston, West Virginia. Small town, Appalachian Hills. A father who worked at the state hospital, and a mother who kept the home. Charlie was the first in his family to go to college. He had an easy smile, a quiet kind of American ambition, and, when the war came, he signed up for the Army Air Forces without hesitation. By late 1943, Brown was assigned to the 379th Bombardment Group, 8th Air Force, flying out of RAF Kimballton in England. His crew, 9 young men from across America, had formed the specific strange brotherhood that forms when men live together, fly together, and come close enough to death every single day to know exactly what they have to lose. They named the aircraft Ye Old Pub, a small joke against the grimness of their work. The 8th Air Force's bombing campaign was one of the most brutal air operations in human history. Between 1942 and 1945, they would lose more than 26,000 men killed in action. The average life expectancy for a heavy bomber crew member in late 1943 was, by some estimates, between 5 and 10 missions. Charlie Brown's crew arrived knowing the numbers. They flew anyway. December 20th, 1943 was Charlie Brown's first combat mission. Let that sit. His first mission. I want to stop here for 1 second, because this is the kind of detail that changes everything. His first mission, not his 10th, not his 20th. His very first time over enemy territory. And this is what happened to him. Tell me in the comments, if this were you on your first day, would you have held it together? Would you have pulled that aircraft out of the dive? I genuinely want to know what you think. The briefing came before dawn on December 20th. At RAF Kimballton, with the English winter still black outside the windows, Charlie Brown and his crew learned their target. The Focke-Wulf 190 fighter aircraft plant at Bremen, Germany, one of the most heavily defended cities in the Reich. Anti-aircraft guns ringed it like a fist. Luftwaffe interceptors layered above it like storm clouds. The 8th Air Force put up hundreds of B-17S and B-24S in a coordinated mass strike. In theory, the tight box formation gave overlapping fields of fire, a wall of lead that German fighters couldn't safely penetrate. In theory. Ye Old Pub took off into a gray English morning and climbed east toward Europe. Then they crossed the German coast, and everything fell apart. The clouds broke badly, the formation scattered. Ye Old Pub drifted from the main group, exposed, isolated, alone. Exactly what a B-17 crew could not afford to be over Bremen. When the German fighters hit them, they came in waves. At least 15 to 21 Focke-Wulf 190 seconds and Messerschmitt 109 seconds. They came from the front, the most lethal attack angle, maximizing closing speed, minimizing response time, and they kept coming. The tail gunner, Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, was killed almost immediately. The oxygen system was hit, 2 engines damaged, the nose cone blown apart by cannon fire. Sergeant Robert Folliard, wounded. Sergeant Alex Yelisenko, a bullet in the shoulder. Co-pilot Lieutenant Spencer Luke, wounded, semi-conscious. Charlie Brown himself was hit by shrapnel. A round caught him in the right arm. He went, briefly, unconscious. When he came back around, the aircraft was in a dive. He pulled it out. He does not know exactly how. A 21-year-old kid, bleeding, oxygen-starved at altitude, one of his closest friends dead in the tail, pulling a 27-ton aircraft back from a terminal dive with his bare hands on controls that barely responded. But he did it. Ye Old Pub leveled out somewhere around 1,000 feet, way below operational altitude, way below safe altitude over hostile territory. Trailing smoke, pointed west, toward England, toward survival. And that is when Franz Stigler saw them. Stigler had just landed to rearm and refuel after the engagement. He'd already shot down 1 American bomber that morning, his 27th kill. He was one kill from the Knight's Cross. Ground control radioed, another damaged American bomber, flying alone, flying low, heading west. He climbed back into his Messerschmitt 109 and went after it. He found Old Pub at less than 1,000 feet, staggering through the air like a wounded animal. And when he pulled up alongside it, close enough to see into the cockpit, close enough to look straight at the face of the pilot, what he saw stopped him cold. He saw a young man, bleeding, barely holding on. He saw the tail gunner's position, silent, and he understood instantly what that silence meant. He flew the full length of the aircraft, wing to wing. He looked at the shattered nose, the dead hydraulics, the smoke trails, the torn metal, the crew at their stations, those who were still alive. And in one single gut-deep moment, Franz Stigler understood exactly what he was looking at. Not a combat aircraft, a flying ambulance. The thought that formed in his mind, the thought that changed everything, was this: a German pilot who shoots down this airplane is not a warrior. He is an executioner. Franz Stigler, who had grown up in Regensburg's cathedrals, who had lost his brother, who carried Rödel's words like a compass, made his decision. He would not do it. What he did instead was one of the most extraordinary acts of the entire air war. He flew alongside Olde Pub. He tried to wave Brown towards Sweden, a neutral country where they could land and survive. Brown, half delirious from blood loss and altitude sickness, didn't understand. He kept pointing west, toward England. So Stigler escorted them, a German fighter pilot, in full Luftwaffe markings, flying formation with a crippled American bomber, until they crossed the German coastline, until they were over the North Sea, away from the anti-aircraft guns, away from other Luftwaffe fighters who would have destroyed Olde Pub on sight. He looked at Charlie Brown one final time. He gave a salute and turned back toward Germany. Stop. I need you to think about what just happened. This man, this German pilot, risked a firing squad. He risked execution. He risked everything he had built his life around for a crew of strangers he would never see again. If this story is hitting you the way it's hitting me right now, hit the like button. It takes 1 second, and it tells the algorithm that stories like this one deserve to be heard. Old Pub made it across the North Sea. It made it back to RAF Kimballton. Charlie Brown landed with a dead tail gunner, a crew of wounded men, and an aircraft that mechanics later said should not have been able to fly at all. He wrote it up in his after-action report. A German pilot who could have killed them didn't. The report was classified. The Army Air Forces buried it. Because this story, a German ace choosing mercy over a kill, was not the story that anyone in Washington in 1943 wanted their bomber crews to hear. Now here is where it gets complicated. Both men survived the war, and for the next 44 years, neither of them spoke publicly about what happened over Bremen on December 20th, 1943. Not to journalists, not to historians, not in any form that made it into the record. Charlie Brown flew his remaining missions, completed his tour, rotated home to West Virginia, built a life, became an engineer, got married, had daughters, became, by every account, a quiet, private, deeply decent man. But the memory of that German pilot, the face he'd seen through the shattered canopy, the salute at the coastline, stayed with him. It was the kind of thing that exists in a man's mind without a category, without a box to put it in. The official story of the air war had no room for it. The mythology of combat had no room for it. An enemy who saves your life is a paradox that takes a very long time to resolve. Franz Stigler's silence was enforced by something more immediate: fear. When he returned to his airfield on December 20th, 1943, and his commander asked where the B-17 kill was, Stigler said it was already in the sea. He lied, because the truth would have gotten him killed. Allowing an enemy aircraft to escape was not just a dereliction of duty. Under Luftwaffe rules of engagement, in December 1943, it was potentially a capital offense. The SS had executed German soldiers for less. If Stigler had told anyone what he'd done, the best outcome was a court-martial. The worst outcome was a firing squad. So he said nothing. He kept flying. He earned his Knight's Cross by February 1944. He flew on the Eastern Front, the Western Front, the final desperate defense of the Reich. He survived the entire war through a combination of extraordinary skill and what he himself later called sheer luck. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Stigler made his way west. He eventually emigrated to Canada, settling in Vancouver, British Columbia, where he built a business, married, raised a family, and tried to leave the war behind. He never spoke publicly about December 20th, 1943. Not for 44 years. Let me give you the full picture of the war these two men were fighting, because it explains why this story was buried and why it took so long to come back. The 8th Air Force's bombing campaign against Germany was one of the most strategically significant and humanly devastating operations of the Second World War. American heavy bombers flew in daylight, a deliberate choice that distinguished them from the British, who bombed at night. The theory was precision. Daylight bombing let crews identify and destroy specific industrial targets: factories, rail yards, oil refineries, the machinery of the Nazi war economy. The theory met reality over places like Bremen, Schweinfurt, and Regensburg. Black Thursday, October 14th, 1943, the second Schweinfurt raid, happened just 2 months before Brown's mission. 60 B-17 shot down in a single day. 600 men. The loss rate was so catastrophic that the 8th Air Force temporarily halted deep penetration raids, waiting for the P-51 Mustang fighter escort that would eventually change the math. By December 1943, the P-51s were just beginning to arrive, but not enough. Not yet. The men of the 8th Air Force flew anyway. Between August 1942 and May 1945, the 8th Air Force flew more than 330,000 individual sorties over Nazi-occupied Europe. They dropped more than 700,000 tons of bombs. They lost 4,145 aircraft and 26,000 men killed in action. A casualty rate across the bomber crews that ran above 50%. Hugh Eckenrode, the tail gunner of Ye Olde Pub, was one of those 26,000. He was 23 years old. His body was brought back to the aircraft. He was buried at Cambridge American Cemetery. 5,127 Americans are interred there, in a field of white crosses and stars of David, on a low hill above the River Cam. Charlie Brown visited that grave more than once. Here is a question that I cannot stop thinking about. If you were Charlie Brown, if you carried this memory for 44 years, what would you do with it? The man who saved your life was your enemy. You could never tell your country. You could never explain it. You just had to live with it. Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. What would you do? 44 years. Charlie Brown carried the memory of the German pilot for 44 years. Through his career, through his marriage, through the raising of his daughters, through the slow passage of ordinary American life. And then, in 1986, at a gathering of 379th Bombardment Group veterans in Seattle, someone asked about memorable missions. And Charlie Brown, for reasons he said he could not entirely explain, told the story. He described December 20th, 1943. The fighter attacks, the dead tail gunner, the aircraft barely flying, and the German pilot who had flown alongside them saluted them and let them go. The room went quiet. Someone suggested he write it down. Someone else suggested he try to find the German pilot, that it wasn't impossible, that German veterans organizations existed, that records survived. Brown began the search in 1986. He placed notices in aviation journals and veteran publications. He contacted historians. He wrote to German pilot associations. He searched archives. For nearly 4 years, nothing. Names that didn't match. Stories that didn't align. Records destroyed or scattered. The German Air Force documentation from Bremen in December 1943 was fragmentary at best. The chaos of the war's end had swallowed whole categories of history, and then, in January 1990, a notice appeared in a newsletter called Alert, published by the American Fighter Aces Association. It read, roughly, a former B-17 pilot is searching for the German Luftwaffe pilot who showed mercy to his crew over northern Germany on December 20th, 1943. If you have information, please contact Charlie Brown. Franz Stigler, living in Vancouver, Canada, read that notice. He read it twice, and then he picked up the telephone. The first phone call between Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler lasted more than an hour. They had to establish it was the same incident. Brown described the aircraft, the date, the location, the condition of his crew. Stigler listened. And then he described, from memory, from the perspective of a Messerschmitt 109 cockpit, the same aircraft, the same day, the same decision. When Brown described the salute at the coastline, Stigler confirmed it. They both understood, in that moment, what it meant. Not just that the right man had been found, but that this thing, this impossible, improbable, deeply human thing, had been real. That both of them had carried it independently in silence for 46 years. That neither of them had told anyone who wasn't already there. Charlie Brown later said in an interview before his death that he cried during that first call. He wasn't sure Stigler knew it. The two men met in person shortly after at Brown's home in Miami, Florida. They were both in their late 60s. Brown, silver-haired and quiet. Stigler, shorter, with the particular stillness of men who have survived impossible things, walked in with a bottle of wine. They shook hands for the first time. They talked for hours. What they said to each other privately in that first meeting, neither man ever fully disclosed. Some things belong to the people who lived them. What emerged publicly over the following years is this. They became close friends. They called each other brothers. They spent a decade giving talks together, at schools, at veteran gatherings, at history conferences. Two old men from opposite sides of the deadliest war in human history, standing side by side, explaining what had happened over Bremen on December 20th, 1943. They were inseparable. Their families became close. Stigler visited Brown in Florida. Brown visited Stigler in British Columbia. For 15 years, they talked almost every week on the telephone. When Franz Stigler was asked, in various interviews over many years, Why he didn't shoot down Ye Old Pub when every rule of engagement and every military obligation told him to, his answer was never complicated. He said, "I saw a crippled aircraft and a crew that could no longer fight. Shooting them down would not have been combat. It would have been murder." He said he thought of Rodel's words. He said he thought of his brother August, shot down over Egypt, and wondered if some pilot on the other side had watched his brother's aircraft and made the same calculation, and had still pulled the trigger. He said, "I wasn't sure I believed in much anymore by that point in the war. I'd flown too long and seen too much. But I believed in that. We are not done yet. What I'm about to tell you about why both governments tried to erase this story and what happened when it finally came out, this is the part that most people never get to. If you are not subscribed yet, do it right now before this video ends. The next story on this channel is one that will genuinely shake you. Subscribe. Now. It is free. And these stories deserve to survive. Now. Why did both governments try to bury this? The American side is easy to understand. The Army Air Forces classified Brown's after-action report, and it stayed classified. By the time the classification lapsed in the normal course of archival review, nobody was actively looking for it. Brown himself didn't push the story publicly until 1986, and even then, his motivation wasn't advocacy. It was personal. He wanted to find the man. He wanted to say something to him. The German side is harder and more interesting. The West German government in the decades after the war built its official memory of the air war around a specific narrative, that the Luftwaffe had fought honorably within the rules of war, distinguishing itself from the SS and the extermination apparatus. This was partly true, and partly self-serving mythology. Historians have been unpacking it for decades, but within that framework, a story like Stigler's presented a specific and uncomfortable problem. Stigler hadn't just acted honorably. He had disobeyed a direct military obligation. He had allowed an enemy aircraft to escape. He had lied to his commanding officer. If the West German government acknowledged Stigler's actions as heroic, they were implicitly acknowledging that the correct action under military law would have been to shoot down a crew of wounded young men. That is not an official position any government wants to hold, so the story was never suppressed by a formal directive. It was simply never told. No German veteran publication sought it out. No archive flagged it for historical interest. Stigler himself, living in Canada, was outside the orbit of German veterans' culture. He had no particular motivation to volunteer a story that had nearly gotten him killed once already. For 44 years, the story existed only in human memory, and human memory is exactly as durable and as fragile as it sounds. When author Adam Makos began researching this story in the early 2010s, eventually publishing his book, A Higher Call, in 2012, he gained access to both Brown and Stigler in their final years. He recorded their accounts in extraordinary detail. The book brought this story to wide public attention for the first time. It became a New York Times bestseller. It was translated into dozens of languages. It sparked something. What it sparked, in part, was grief. Because Charlie Brown died on November 24th, 2008. Franz Stigler died on March 22nd, 2008, 8 months before Brown. They died within a year of each other. These two men who had found each other after 46 years of searching, who had called each other brothers, who had stood up in front of rooms full of school children and said, "Look, what is possible?" They were both 92 years old. There is a photograph taken sometime in the early 2000s of Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler standing together at what appears to be a speaking engagement. A school gymnasium, folding chairs visible behind them. They are both old men, Brown is taller, Stigler is smiling. They are standing the way old friends stand. Close, comfortable, without any self-consciousness at all. Like men who have been through something together. Which they had. Just on opposite sides. The photograph is striking not because it is dramatic or professionally composed. It is striking because it looks ordinary. Two old men at a community event. You would not look twice if you didn't know the story. That ordinariness, I think, is the entire point. What Franz Stigler did on December 20th, 1943, was not a strategic act. It didn't change the course of the war. Germany lost anyway, surrendering unconditionally on May 8th, 1945, with Berlin in ruins. The bombing campaign Stigler had spent years defending against had, together with the ground assaults on multiple fronts, broken the Nazi war machine to its foundations. Hugh Eckenrode was still dead. The 26,000 men of the 8th Air Force were still dead. The millions of victims of the Holocaust were still dead. Franz Stigler's one act of mercy didn't redeem any of that. But that is not what we are talking about when we talk about this story. What we are talking about is the margin, the space, the tiny, costly, almost invisible space that exists even inside the machinery of total war, where a human being can choose to be something other than what the machinery demands. Stigler found that space in 30 seconds of flight over northern Germany. Looking through a shattered canopy at a bleeding American kid he had never met and would never see again. He chose something in that space. And 46 years later, on a telephone in Vancouver, Canada, he heard a voice from the past confirm that the choice had mattered, that it had been real. The tail gunner, Hugh Eckenrode, 23 years old, from Duncansville, Pennsylvania, is buried at Cambridge American Cemetery. Plot F, row 14, grave 1. 5,127 Americans are buried there, in a field of white crosses and stars of David, on a low hill above the River Cam. The cemetery is open every day. Visitors walk the rows and read the names. The 379th Bombardment Group flew 330 combat missions between May 1943 and May 1945, more missions than any other 8th Air Force group in the war. They dropped 26,460 tons of bombs. They lost 141 aircraft and 733 men killed. Charlie Brown flew 17 more missions after December 20th, 1943. He completed his tour in spring 1944 and rotated home to the United States. He received the Air Medal and multiple oak leaf clusters. He was never publicly decorated for the December 20th mission specifically, because officially there was nothing to decorate him for. He had completed the mission, landed, filed his report, and moved on. The report sat in a classified file for decades. The Knight's Cross that Stigler received in February 1944, the medal he had been one kill away from earning when he chose mercy over the kill, was awarded for subsequent engagements. The citation mentions nothing about December 20th, 1943. There is no German record of what happened that day, because the man who could have created one chose silence instead. After Brown and Stigler found each other and began giving their talks together, they were asked repeatedly by journalists and historians and schoolchildren what lesson the story was supposed to carry. What were they trying to say? Both men resisted the easy answers. Neither wanted to be used to argue that the war was morally equivalent on both sides. Neither wanted the story reduced to a feel-good message about enemies becoming friends. What they said, in various formulations over many years, was something quieter and harder. They said, the war was full of young men who didn't start it, who didn't design it, who were handed a uniform and a set of orders and told to go. Most of them did what was asked. A very few, in a very few moments, found the space to do something else. Stigler found that space. Brown landed the airplane. Eckenrode died in the tail. And 46 years later, two old men stood in school gymnasiums and tried to explain what all of it meant. Charlie Brown is buried in a private grave. Franz Stigler's ashes were scattered, by his own request, over the Pacific Ocean. The aircraft they shared for those extraordinary minutes over northern Germany, ye old pub, was scrapped in the drawdown at the war's end. No memorial flight, no museum. The aluminum was melted and repurposed, probably into something domestic. The machinery of war becomes the machinery of peacetime, and the names on the aircraft are forgotten. Hugh Eckenrode's grave in Cambridge, England, is maintained by the American Battle Monuments Commission. The cemetery is open every day. This is the story that two governments spent decades not telling, not because it was unimportant, but because it was too important, too human, too complicated, too resistant to the clean moral lines that wartime stories are supposed to carry. The air war over Germany was brutal and necessary and morally complex and full of extraordinary courage and enormous waste and individual acts of grace and countless private tragedies. Hugh Eckenrode died in the tail. Charlie Brown pulled a dying aircraft home. Franz Stigler found a crack in the machinery of total war and pushed something human through it. All of it is true. All of it happened. And now you know it. If this story stays with you, and I promise you it will, there is a book called A Higher Call by Adam Makos, published in 2012. The author spent years with both Brown and Stigler before they died and captured their voices in a way that no video can fully match. I will link it below. And if you want to know the full story, the parts I couldn't fit here, the crew members who survived, the missions that followed, the final years of both men, drop a comment below saying, more. If enough of you ask, I will do a full extended follow-up episode. There are more stories like this one, stories from the margins of the wars America fought, the moments where the script broke down and human beings did something unexpected. The next story is one that almost nobody knows. A decision made in a hospital tent in Korea that changed the course of the entire conflict. The Army buried it for 30 years. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Like this video if it changed how you see the air war. And share it, because this story deserves to outlast the men who lived it. I will see you in the next one.